I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is the fourth episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame mini-series, series within the series. We will talk about the ones that we've already covered here in a little bit, but this is the fourth episode and we're getting into the 1940s. This story was published in 1940. We'll get into that issue in a little bit. I am your host, David Agranoff. If you're a Heinleiner who just came here for the first time, you haven't seen my podcast before, I am the author of The Last Night to Kill Nazis, a vampire novel set on the last night of World War II. And but I host this here podcast, and I also host another podcast called Dickheads. We've covered 3 Robert Heinlein books on Dickheads. And I was not a big fan of any of them. I'm not a big Heinleiner. Probably my favorite of the ones we covered was Starship Troopers, which I philosophically do not like the take on it, but I thought it was a good novel. But we did that as an April Fool's episode of Dickheads. As the Heinleiners, but we also covered Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and we also covered Stranger in a Strange Land. So if you want to hear me pontificate about Heinlein, you can get more of that there. Our Starship Troopers episode is pretty famous because Anthony absolutely despised the book with a hatred of like 10,000 burning suns. So he really let go on that one. He was not a big Heinlein fan. But anyways, I have 2 guests here to talk about The Roads Must Roll. Ted Hand, you wanted to be on this one. Right when I announced this, you said you wanted to talk about The Roads Must Roll. Ted Hand, tell the folks who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks, and it's a pleasure to be on your show again. So I'm a public school teacher and independent scholar working on Philip K. Dick and especially his weird mystical religious experiences. So Heinlein is kind of a secondary interest for me, especially in the way that he's an influence on Philip K. Dick and especially Robert Anton Wilson, who I do a lot of work on too. And one of the things that just blows my mind about Heinlein is that even though he's this square, kind of hard science fiction, engineering type, he was interested in Aleister Crowley. And, that becomes a big part of Stranger in a Strange Land, right? This whole like weird mystical occult kind of interest. And, he was, I was going to say that, the connection with L. Ron Hubbard, right, who stole away Jack Parsons' wife, right, and was involved in all this weird LA occultism, like that Heinlein was tuned into that. I just find so fascinating, and I think plugs into the this whole like West Coast tech bro occultism thing that we see exemplified in like Mondo 2000 or whatever.
Yeah, and we'll get into more details because that is the era that this was written in and came out of. So we'll get into more details after we do some of the biographical stuff about Heinlein. Juan Sanmiguel, you are returning to Postcards from a Dying World. You came on for one of the Star Treks, didn't you? And you came on for V. I know you were on for V.
I came on for V. I don't know if I came on to another show. It's been a while, though.
Yeah, I think you did one of the Star Treks with us, but I could be wrong. I know
I wanted to.
Yeah. I know you were here for the 100th episode focused on V, which the classic miniseries from the 1980s. One of my favorite episodes. So you're part of one of my favorite episodes. But Juan, tell the folks who you are and your science fiction bona fides.
Okay. Name's Juan Sanmiguel. My day job is a government engineer. Uh, I've been active in fandom since my teens. I've been reading, I've done reviews, I've worked on cons. I've been to over 30 world cons, 2 of them virtual. So I'm active, and I am a big Heinlein fan. I've read most of his books and shorter works. I think there are a few that are missing here and there, and I think Heinlein did influence on my life. I think I came at the right sweet spot in history reading it before. As an Xer, I think we had that sweet spot when he was alive, and before I think he went out of date, I, or became more of a became more of a historical item, for lack of a better word.
Well, and people might be catching on that what I'm doing here. I had a robotics professor on for Helen of Lloyd. Of course, Juan, you were on my list because you're an engineer. And with the story, I knew I needed somebody who had at least some kind of passing engineering knowledge because I have none. I'm not an engineer. That's nothing I know anything about. Um, so you could see why, but also just your knowledge on Heinlein, I knew you'd be a valuable person. Very active and involved in the science fiction community. You have your own science fiction book club locally there.
It's a science fiction club in Orlando.
Yeah.
The Orlando Area Science Fiction Society. We do try to do both virtual and live meetings, although the next 2 meetings are virtual because the public library is doing some important stuff in the meeting room that they have. So you can catch us if you type in Orlando Science Fiction. We're usually the first one to come up in Google.
Nice. All right, so let's talk about Robert Heinlein. He was born on well, actually, before we get into him, let's remember that the reason for the season is the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And we're covering all the stories. So Roads Must Roll is the next one, the first of the 1940s. If you want more details on how they were selected and whatever, go back to episode 1 where we covered A Martian Odyssey, because we talked, Steve Davidson and Cora Bullard and I, about the process. So if you want to know how they were selected, but these were generally selected by members of SFWA, the Science Fiction Writers Association, as their favorites, and each author got one story. So this is the one Heinlein story that was chosen as the Hall of Fame. The last episode that we did, Helen of Lloyd, was one of the only stories that was not voted in. That was selected by Robert Silverberg. This one was voted in. So obviously, it plays an important role in science fiction, and we'll get to whether we think it's Hall of Fame worthy later. Heinlein was born July 7th, 1907, to Rex Heinlein and Bam Lynn Heinlein in Butler, Missouri. He was the third of 7 children, so he was a part of a big family. He was a 6th-generation German American, and Heinlein would go on incessantly about the fact that the Heinleins had fought in every American war, starting with the War of Independence. So his family tradition of being a part of wars is obviously something that you see reflected in books like Starship Troopers, which is one of his most famous books. If you don't know Heinlein, he is most famous for having written Stranger in a Strange Land, Moon is a Heart's Mistress, Starship Troopers. I'm assuming if you're listening this far, you already have a passing knowledge of science fiction and would know these things, but maybe you don't. This is where he comes from. He is considered one of the most important science fiction writers of the 20th century. So he was going to be in this collection for sure. He spent most of his childhood in Kansas City, Missouri. long before the Chiefs started dominating in football over there. He had kind of Bible Belt-ish upbringing, very religious upbringing, a very important thing for him and his development as a fan of space and all things science fictional was seeing Halley's Comet in 1910. And I think, you know, he was a reader from the beginning of your H.G. Wells, your Jules Verne, so he was an early adopter of science fiction, although he did not have like one particular book that was one that I could find that was like kind of the link. Unless, Juan, do you know anything about his childhood with that?
No, the most thing I remember about the early Heinlein was that the thing that stuck out to me, I only read the first, I never got around to reading the second half of the biography, and that was just for time, was the fact that his family lucked out that at least they first lucked out that they didn't lose anybody in World War I or in the epidemic that came after, although unfortunately one of the younger daughters got run over by a wagon wheel. So, but considering the fact that they didn't lose anybody to war or the biggest plague at the time, I think was something that I think affected, that was important in his development.
Wagon wheel, really? Okay, yeah. Well, Clifford Samac rode a horse to high school. So, when we get into these older science fiction writers, we hear, um, you know, clear indications of the passage of time, right? Ted, anything on Heinlein's childhood that you want to comment on, or?
Oh gosh, I'm not an expert on the biography.
Well, that's okay. You don't need to be. I don't expect anyone to do that except for me. If they if they don't need to. In 1934, so Heinlein joined the Navy, and it was very important to him. His service in the Navy was like a big deal. He joined in the early 30s. He was discharged from the Navy because of tuberculosis, and he had a lengthy hospitalization. Um, and so supposedly because of his experience being bedridden, in one of his stories, he claims to have invented the waterbed in one of the stories. And you know how like science fiction writers a lot of times claim to have invented things that they wrote about long before, not because they made them, but because they thought of them, right?
Well,
Um,
supposedly nobody could get a patent on the waterbed because he described it. I forget which book. I thought it was Stranger, but I could be wrong about that. And nobody could file a patent on it. In fact, when he died, I remember they did a news break and they said, among other things, he invented the waterbed.
right. So maybe a greater claim to inventing the waterbed than Al Gore and the internet, but it's somewhat dubious. But either way, he got discharged and he ended up wanting to study mathematics and physics, which makes sense. And he ended up at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. And that's really important to the whole Heinlein trajectory because him ending up in LA is how he got involved with the science fictional community. And we know that he was reading the pulps like during his time in the Navy, and that he was a science fiction reader, but his love of the genre, it was less, some of the writers got involved because they had like a serious love for the genre, but I think with Heinlein a lot of it was that he wanted to make money. And you know thought that this was a way to make money, and he tried writing a novel first, which is unusual in that era because usually short stories is where you start, and he wrote a novel called For Us the Living. And it was important because it started off the Heinlein tradition of writing about social political issues because he was arguing for a universal basic income in this first attempt at a novel. It did not sell. It got rejected lots of places, but he got enough feedback that and he wrote it in 1939, and supposedly he wrote it in about 4 days. So if you wonder why it didn't sell, maybe because he wrote it so goddamn fast.
Well, it's I read For Us a Living because somebody decided to publish it years after his death. I forget what it was, and I bought a copy, and it's very rough. Let's put it that way. In fact, I told people you shouldn't read this unless you're a scholar, because it's rough. It's very early. It's and it's a rough work. It might have not have been a good idea to publish it. It should have been maybe put in the papers where an academic like David could take a look at it later on.
Well, which is exactly my when people ask me about Earthshaker, the Philip K. Dick's first attempt at a novel, which, by the way, is only two versions of 2 chapters. He wrote 4 chapters of Earthshaker, but it's really the first chapter twice. And I tell people all the time that people are like, someone should publish it. And I'm like, no one should publish it. It is really just for academics. And my experience reading Earthshaker in the library was that I kept snorting and laughing out loud in the library and getting like looks from the Cal State Fullerton librarians. So and I assume that For Us the Living is very similar. Okay, so you have read it then, Juan. Well, that's interesting. I probably would read it if I had the shot, but he was 31 when he wrote it, so in his first attempt. And then he wrote a novella called If This Goes On was next, and I'm getting this out of Astounding. Alec Neville-Lee's fantastic book. He's been on this series. He was in our second episode on John W. Campbell's Twilight. And I think his first story to sell to Astounding was Lifeline. And then his second story was Roads Must Roll. So have either of you read Lifeline? Because I have not read that.
I have.
Juan?
I mean, it's an idea story where a guy, I believe his name is Panero, invents a device which will tell you when you will die. Not how you will die, but when you will die, how much of a lifespan you're going to have. And of course, this throws the actuary world into chaos and the results of what that was.
Right. And so Lifeline was written for a contest for Astounding. It wasn't actually submitted straight up. It was in a contest, and he was the first place prize winner. And then I believe that kind of opened up the door with Campbell for him to submit eventually Roads Must Roll. So but Lifeline plays obviously an important role in this because it's his first story. But I think all these early stories, when you're talking about how early we are in this in Heinlein's journey, everyone should, I mean, it's here, it's being honored in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, but keep in mind, this was really only his second professional, or really his first professional sale, to be honest with you, because the first one was a contest.
Are you sure about the contest? I thought the story was he wrote it for the contest, but he didn't submit it because he thought it was too good for the contest and tried to sell it directly. That's how I remember it, but I could be wrong.
I believe, according to my notes, it was the first place prize.
Okay.
Oh, wait, no, you are right. You're right. Now I'm looking at my notes closer. He wrote it for the contest and pulled it out of the contest because he wanted to because the pay was not great for the contest, and he did sell it. You are correct.
So he got that 1 cent a word.
Yeah. So he got the money for that one. So Lifeline was number 1, but keep in mind when we're breaking this down, this was really only his second sale. So Heinlein would go on to be, a much more skilled writer. And certainly when we talk about stories that we think maybe, which ones deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, maybe we'll find some other stories we think are a little better. He sold this one, and then his third story was Misfit. And but it really these stories are kind of showing his like social political nature from the very beginning and selling these kind of social sci-fi stories. So before we get into the actual issue, let's talk about the environment that Heinlein was writing in. Heinlein was a part of much like what Juan is doing today with his science fiction group in Orlando. A group of writers in LA had their science fiction club where they hung out. This was a common thing at the time. In New York City at the time, we had the Futurians, which has your Frederick Pauls, your Judith Merrills, your Isaac Asimovs, that were all hanging out, doing things together, talking about science fiction, sharing, critiquing each other's work. C.M. Kornbluth, another one that was part of that. And eventually in New York, the Futurians fell apart and they had another one called the Hydra Club. Eventually, Tony Boucher would do one in the Bay Area, which would meet on Thursday nights on Dana Street at his house. But at this time, Boucher was living in LA, like Heinlein and L. Ron Hubbard and the Kuttners, which would be your Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore. These are all people that were part of the Manana Literary Society. This is a lot of really heavyweight science fiction writers. Lee Brackett, Edmund Hamilton, eventually. So all these science fiction, and Forrest J. Ackerman, they're all hanging out in the science fiction club. And they were also hanging out with Jack Parsons, who would go on to found the Jet Propulsion Lab. And that's when we're going to get into stuff Ted's really excited to talk about. But this crew was fictionalized and kind of lampooned in Tony Boucher's mystery novel Rocket to the Morgue, which is a Knives Out style locked room Agatha Christie type murder mystery. This is basically science fiction history right here. If you can, and now I'm about to publish an article in my Amazing Stories column where I talk about this book and I talk about the different fictional names and how they correspond with real life people and Rocket to the Morgue. You can learn a lot about the Manana Literary Society by reading this book. This book rules. It's not the best murder mystery, but as an artifact of science fiction, it's really good. And so this is the 2019 edition that I'm holding up here for the YouTube watchers. And it has an introduction by homie of the podcast, F. Paul Wilson, who was one of our first guests on the show. And it's really, really good. We covered that in detail and Tony Boucher in detail on Dickheads on the Shout Out to Tony episode, which is a panel of science fiction dignitaries talking about Tony Boucher. But we're here to talk about Heinlein. So Heinlein was a part of this group. He was a really big and active part of this group. And so this is where he learned the science fiction community. He learned how to submit stories. He got a lot of advice on how to write. And so we're talking 39 through 41 is when the Manana Society was super active. They didn't just talk about science fiction. They had a lot of high profile guests come to talk to their meetings. Writers would come from all over the country to visit LA and they would be guests. Robert Bloch, for example, would come from Milwaukee on the bus and visit. But they had a lot of physicists and people from Caltech and real rocket scientists who would come to these literary society meetings. And so they were a big deal. And this is a heavy part of the environment in which Heinlein was writing from. And I think it's important to understand what the Manana Literary Society meant for like the percolating. When you read this story, you should know that this was happening in this guy's life when he was writing this, in my opinion. Ted, you're bursting at the seams to talk about this era. I know it. So, what are your thoughts on the Manana Literary Society?
Well, I mean, I don't know a lot about the Literary Society, but I know a bit about Jack Parsons and and Hubbard, right? And the way that in Los Angeles at the time, and this is not like when I was a kid and I learned about this stuff, my mind was blown like, wait, it's the 1940s, and there's this like sort of free love thing happening that informed what Heinlein was doing in Stranger in a Strange Land. So Aleister Crowley was this occultist who died in 1947, flourished in like the teens and 20s, and he was an influence on Jack Parsons, who was sort of like an acolyte of this guy's occult society. And I guess he had his wife stolen from him by Hubbard, who took her off to go, flit about on his yacht and whatever. And Parsons, I guess, eventually blows himself up in a lab experiment where he's like trying to reproduce some kind of alchemy, right? Where he like apparently like dropped a beaker or something and blew himself up. So
As one does.
yeah, as one does, at the time. And Parsons was this legitimate genius. It sort of reminds me of the portrayal of Oppenheimer in that recent movie, right? Where like he's involved in this communist society, and he's this womanizer, right? So the question that I have is like, how early did Heinlein get involved in, or at least take an interest in, these kind of uncommon arrangements among creative bohemian types?
Well, it seems like this was starting around 39, like this whole like group and thing. And I know that there's more writings about, because there's a tradition in, obviously the Futurians are a tradition in New York, but LA has a long tradition of writers groups in different generations. Eventually Bradbury, Matheson, Nolan, and that crew would become the California sorcerers, right? And so there's different generations of this. But the Manana Literary Society, which what made them very different was just, because they were starting to get power as writers, as they were getting notoriety, not power, but notoriety as pulp writers. But they were having these like really crazy associations with different groups and communities and so on and so forth. But because you're in LA, there's all kinds of that stuff happening. And when we did our Richard Matheson episode, David Scow was talking about how he learned about how they would have the California sorcerers would get all kinds of interesting guests hanging around just because it's LA. And for example, Rod Serling and William Shatner are dropping by to, hang out and, race fast cars, with these guys. So, there's all kinds of really interesting stuff happening on, how much of that, is fictionalized in Rocket to the Morgue and how much is believable. I don't know. I don't know how much license Tony Boucher was taking with that. But far more interesting group than the one I don't know, because the group he gathered in Berkeley was pretty interesting too, with your Philip K. Dick and Marion Zimmer Bradley too. So
I've got one quick comment about that just, I'm glad you said the Berkeley thing. So if you listen to the Ray Nelson interview, where Ray Nelson was interviewed by Ann Dick or somebody and talks about Philip K. Dick, I think it was Ann's research for her book. Nelson talks about how Philip K. Dick and his sort of circle would have philosophical romances with each other's wives. And so like Dick and Nelson's wife like kind of carried on in this like what we might today call an emotional affair, um, where they had these sort of open relationships, and you know the way Dick was such a sort of like, I mean, he was so forward with women, and oh, you're such a fox, right? And but apparently it would be a so-called philosophical romance where it was like platonic, but they were like acting as if they were lovers and kind of connecting over literature or music or whatever they were interested in. So,
Well, it
I mean,
wasn't philosophical with Grania Davis, your pal Grania. So
right, yeah. And I wish that Urania had told me more about that scene, but unfortunately, she passed away a few weeks after she decided finally that I could interview her. So we'll never know.
well, yeah, and so, but the Mignana Literary Society, I don't know how much of the free. I haven't seen a lot of writings about the free love stuff, but what I do know is that they were talking to powerful people with engineering backgrounds and things like that. And I think for Roads Must Roll and what we're talking about today, it's most important to know that he was getting that kind of intellectual stimulation for those types of things. So, when people are like, wow, the rocket science is pretty far ahead thinking for the 1930s or 19 or for the early 40s or whatever. That's what a lot of it is. So you take a look at a story like Nerves by Lester Del Rey and you're like, wow, he really like nailed a lot of aspects of nuclear power before it was even supposed to happen. But I bet it's things like meetings at these types of things where like there are a few drinks are had and engineers start like blabbing to the science fiction writers, and the next thing you know, you've got a story. So I think the role of the Mignana Literary Society and Rhodes Must Roll is the thing, you know. But Juan, what do you know about the Mignana Literary Society, and what do you think of its impact on science fiction in general?
I'm a bit weak. I did read Rocket to the Morgue, but it was a long time ago. I should reread it. And I think it was mentioned, obviously, in the first chapter, in the first volume, I should say, of the Heinlein biography. But I'm not sure of how to gauge an impact, although obviously it's very good for writers to, have groups to workshop and bounce ideas off of. So, but I don't feel comfortable saying what kind of impact it made.
Right. And so, for example, like I just opened a one page of my Rocket to the Morgue, and you can see I highlighted my and this is a scene that takes place on Halloween in 1941. And he explains that, the Mignana Literary Society, Austin Carter stated, calling it that because people talk about the terrific honey of a story they're going to write tomorrow. And Austin Carter was the Heinlein stand-in, I believe, if my memory serves. But, you know, these are, I mean, he's really writing directly about the history of it all and the genre. So I really recommend this book too. So
So my
uh,
question, if I can cut in real quick,
sure.
about the Manana Society and Heinlein's discussions with engineers is, in Rhodes Must Roll, we're so concerned with the working conditions of engineers, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of Oppenheimer once again, and how they were sort of like rock stars, like physicists were like these weird rock stars, and they could kind of get away with murder because of this like position in society that they had. Um, did Heinlein have a sense of the engineer as like a rock star? These guys that he was hanging out with. What were there discussions about working conditions of engineers?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, what little we know, um, that's not an angle Boucher's going at in Rocket to the Morgue, but um and by the way, I should say I now that I'm looking at my notes, I do have, yeah, Austin Carter is clearly Heinlein. D. Vance Winpool is Hubbard. Halstead Pin is a fictionalized version of Forrest Ackerman. And then there's a character named Don Stewart, who's obviously John W. Campbell, because that was one of his pen names. And one thing that should be interesting to me too is that his second professional sale is in 1940, and Heinlein was already a guest of honor a year later at the Denver Science Fiction Convention. After 1 year after selling his first story, which is kind of fascinating.
Well, I thought he sold Lifeline in 39. Am I wrong about that?
Yes, you are
Oh,
right. So it would have been 2 years. Yeah, 2 years.
I mean, I think one of the reasons Heinlein had to get a lot of pseudonyms was I guess he was able to sell what Campbell wanted. And so, I mean, he would have multiple stories with different names. I don't know if that happened in 40, that he had already, gotten a good reputation, that he
Right.
would be guest of honor.
Yeah, yeah, it's strange, but well, let's look at the issues. So for those of you who are listening to the audio, this is the portion where some of this might not make a lot of sense if you're only listening to the audio. If you're watching YouTube, we're going to actually look at the issue. And there it is. This is the cover article, or the cover art for The Roads Must Roll. So it was June of 1940. So, Hitler only invaded Poland a year earlier, a year and a couple months change. You buy this issue for 20 cents. And what do you guys think of this cover art?
Well, actually, I'm surprised because I think I might have got either a publisher used this for a cover of If This Must Go On, or I just misremembered it. I thought this was the If This Goes On cover for some
Right.
reason.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have these wheeled vehicles, but it's not the roads rolling too. So but Heinlein made the cover for his second appearance, which is pretty amazing. I think people figured out right away this guy's got something. So let's take a look inside the issue. Let's look at the ads. Listerine. We have that beautiful Listerine ad. Spark plugs. Smith and Street had no control over what ads, or the editors hadn't so let's look at the table of contents. So Roads Must Roll opened the issue. I think the only really other notable entry, I don't know, Juan, if you have anything on any of these other stories, but the only other one that really stands out to me is Hubbard. And this was the third and final serialization of The Final Blackout, which was in my opinion my favorite L. Ron Hubbard novel. And if no one has read The Final Blackout, The Final Blackout is about World War II, written before it happened. And it kind of talks about like this charismatic kind of anarchist general and nuclear war. And it is less of an impressive thing if you're not looking back on the history and looking at that he was writing this obviously in 1930, mostly 1939 is when he wrote it. It was published obviously in three issues of Astounding. This was the third and final serialization. So in a lot of these discussions of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, we look at what else was there. Now, Final Blackout to me might be the better of the stories, but it's a serialization of a novel. So when you're talking about short stories, or novelettes, I guess you say, a novelette is really just a very long short story. So I don't really think The Roads Must Roll constitutes a novella. It's close, but I think it's mostly a short story. And as far as the other stories, I don't know any of these. Deputy Correspondent, the
No, I don't recognize the names either.
Yeah, and Norman L. Knight, I don't know him. Don't know any of these guys. So, so sorry if I don't know if Cora Bueller's out there screaming at us, no, that story is very important. But for me, I don't know any of these other stories. I just know Final Blackout. But I will say you can get Final Blackout as a paperback. Unfortunately, your money is going to be going to the Church of Scientology if you buy a new one. But if you can find it at a library or whatever, if you don't want to give Scientology your money, and I certainly understand that, I highly recommend reading Final Blackout. It's a long-running joke on the Dickheads podcast that Anthony promised me he was going to read the Final Blackout in the first year of the podcast and has still not read the Final Blackout. So if you guys want to tweet at Anthony that he still hasn't read the Final Blackout, you can do that. He's still not read it. So read how these men got better jobs. Look what radio offers you. I will train you at home in your spare time for a good job in radio. So an early ad for podcasting. And then here it is. The original appearance of the Roads Must Roll. The higher civils. You want me to zoom it in here, guys?
No, I'm good. I just wanted to take a look at the art.
Yeah, it's pretty good art. We specialize in giving people nightmares. The ad for Unknown there on the left too, which is a great ad. The higher civilization becomes the more dependent on each unit, and the more of it as at the mercy of the few. So yeah, it's an interesting take, but and I'm not sure if there's other art in it. We can flip through it a little bit. So if anyone wants to look at this, there's a few more here. The patrol had him before he could reach the signal box to sound the alarm, but somewhere ahead, another had spotted them. So they're putting a lot of money and energy into this story. Here's another piece of artwork. So at least 3 illustrations so far. 4. Yeah, 4 illustrations in here. And and then here's the next story. Deputy correspondent. That looks interesting. There's some kind of creature throwing a pyramid. Maybe we'll have to go back and read Deputy Correspondent at some point. But yeah, the Roads Must Roll. So it took up the first 38 pages of the magazine, or 30 pages, give or take, without the ads. So yeah, that's how it appeared. So if you want to see this, it's on the Internet Archive. You can search by June 1940 Astounding, and you will find it. So there it is. So it's actually not a super great issue of Astounding. Some of these that we've covered in the 1930 series and of Weird Tales and of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, there's like 4 or 5 bangers all in one issue. And here I would say, I mean, I haven't read the other stories, but there's 2 classics involved here, The Final Blackout and Roads Must Roll. So, you know, that is a big deal that there's another classic, but really only the 2. So now let's get into the story of Roads Must Roll. It was only adapted once. It's never been a movie. It was adapted for radio for X minus 1, you know, which, by the way, was the first radio series, or the first adaptations of Philip K. Dick. We got 2, which we have are planning on covering soon on the Dickheads podcast, but stay tuned for that. I know Colony, and I can't remember the other one. There were 2 Philip K. Dick adaptations, one of which he adapted himself. And so it was his first time writing for another medium. But Heinlein did not adapt this one, but I will say this X-1 is a very faithful adaptation. It is very close to the story. And so does anybody want to give kind of a refresher of what the story's about if somebody decided to just listen to us and not actually read the story? Juan, are you interested in doing that?
I'll try. Essentially, we're in the future. I'd say, if my guess is right, 40 years into the future from publication. Essentially,
70s or
cars.
80s. Sometime 70s or 80s. So about
Yeah.
40, 50 years out. Yeah.
Okay. And so the car has been replaced by these mobile roads, and we stumble on an early meeting of the techs who keep the roads running, and somebody is suggesting that maybe if their demands are not met, they should do something about it. And then we switch over to the chief engineer, who finds out that something has happened in Sacramento, and some of the roads are not rolling, and they got to fix that. And that's the main problem of the story of trying to fix it. I mean, would you guys agree that's a good summation? I'm very bad at summations sometimes because I try not to give the spoiler away on it, even if it's something old like this.
Yeah, and we're gonna spoil. So you might as well yeah, so basically there's kind of a like union type movement that is like, you know, striking against like the tyranny of the roadish type thing of like, you know, of the system being this way. And I read it a couple weeks ago, and I have to say, this is my first time reading The Roads Must Roll, which I hadn't read it before this. And, you know, admittedly, I've said I'm not much of a Heinleiner. Um, you know, I'm a PKD, John Brunner, Le Guin guy. I'm not much of a Heinlein fan. However, I will say that I did think the story had a lot of really neat ideas, and considering when it was written, I think it has a lot of really good and interesting things to say. Ted, did we miss anything that you think is really important?
Yeah, so what I want to add is that there's sort of two castes of workers who work on the roads, right? There's the engineer class, and then there is the I'm not sure what you call the like blue collar guys.
I would call them techs.
Yeah, and the techs are sort of like resentful of the engineers who have kind of better working conditions, and uh, it's also sort of an allegory for the Teamsters, you know, like Jimmy Hoffa being mobbed up, and the way that sort of like the trucking lobby can kind of like bring the nation to its knees, right? So this weird reckoning of like of power being in a union, and the sort of logic of union busting. I mean, I think if you were to lampoon this story, you might call it "The Boots Must Be Licked." Right? Where it's like, you know, we have to crack down on workers who are trying to agitate for better conditions, because our whole society runs on these people being exploited, right? And you know, this goes for workers in general, but especially once society starts running on technology, the technology workers become so essential, right?
Right. And this is one of the things for me about Heinlein that's so confusing for me, because his politics and his views are so all over the place. Because yes, it has this kind of bootlicking, kind of anti-union, like we got to keep the roads rolling. And I know he's not necessarily saying that's how he feels, but that's how the characters feel. But we know that he becomes like this hardcore libertarian eventually. And this is clearly before he established those libertarian views, I think. At least it seems to me. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I do have to question one thing, and this might get my friend Olaf from the Hugo Book Club. We might have to disagree on this, because I find it interesting. I mean, I took some notes, and the thing is, they seem to defend that conditions were bad in 1960. That's why I say it's in the 80s. And they're talking about, hey, we had this big strike in the 60s, and we fixed up a lot of things. The conditions are better, and they argue. But then I question, is this a strike? Because usually when you have a strike, and I'm basing it on what I've seen in the recent SAG after a Writers Guild strike, you usually say, hey, we're done negotiating, we're now going to strike. We never get an ultimatum from the workers. We see a meeting where a certain shady individual is doing something. We only find out that there's been a work stoppage because some of the roads start malfunctioning or not operating. So I
Right. And
just feels
in the
it just doesn't
radio,
feel like a strike or
yeah,
traditional
no,
strike.
in the radio story, there's somebody who says, we got to take direct action. And so you definitely see them as like doing sabotage more than striking, I guess you could say. And then it's really unclear whether Heinlein is, and I think this is one of the best things about the writing of it. It's unclear whether Heinlein is for or against the roads, or necessarily, or for or against the workers. Is you kind of see some of the, there's kind of a push pull between all the views of the characters in the story, and he could be coming from different points of views on that. At least I saw it that way. I don't know.
Well, one of the other things I took notes on is when Gaines, who is our lead engineer, he's the guy who's in charge of the roads, at least of the West Coast, maybe of the whole country. He doesn't want anybody killed. He tells people to use weapons of non-lethal intent to gas, the people when they're going to try to retake control of Sacramento. So I mean, at least, we're not going out there with guns blazing, shooting people. I don't know what the strikes, the labor actions in Heinlein's lifetime would have influenced him. But at least, you're trying not to get anybody hurt who doesn't need to get hurt. It seems like we have a clear villain of Van Clink, or no, Van Cleek, I believe his name is. Is that how his name was pronounced on the radio?
I just listened to it, and I don't remember.
Well, essentially, we got this guy who has, and I don't know, who comes up with this thing called functionalism, which I just reread it briefly, and correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like, hey, your function in society lets you to lord it on other people's function who might not be as important. And Heinlein cut, and I don't know if this was a real thing or not, because it said it was published in 1930, and there were, I think, a lot of movements. I think correct me if I'm wrong. Huey Long, had the Kingfish or Every Man's a King movement in Louisiana. And, Heinlein suggested everybody, had a crackpot theory of how to fix the world in 6 easy steps in the 30s.
Well,
So
the
I don't
30s
know.
Was a very radical time. There was
Yeah, unstable.
yeah, and there was a lot of cracking down on unions. So that was a thing. We had in San Diego, there were free speech fights as early as the 19 teens, like with the unions. So, with
But also, wasn't it the growth of unions with the Federal Labor Act and the unionizing of Hollywood at that time? Again, correct. I'm basing it on recent things I heard about the history of
yeah,
strikes, and the fact that
well,
there was an animators union and Disney would eventually get absorbed into it in the mid 40s.
yeah, there was clearly a lot for him to draw on for this era, specifically about like how labor unions were treated and such. So, um, I think what's one of the cool things about the story, that it's commenting on these things and that it has things to say about it. But
I've got two quick points to make on that.
sure.
First of all, I would agree with you that it is very successful as an accessible allegory of union power, right? When you said, I'm going to be reading this story, I just, tweeted right back at you, because I'm like, I remember reading that as a kid. It was like really hard for me to get into science fiction stories from back in the day, but I was super interested, and this was a story that, like, I remember the whole scene with where they're stepping onto the roads, and you kind of like, roads are kind of next to each other, like one moving faster than the other, so that you can kind of step up your speed. If you want to be, get onto the 100-mile-an-hour road, you get onto the 60-mile-an-hour, then you step over to the 65, then you step over to the, like, this was such a memorable image for me that, 30 years later, I'm like, oh yeah, I totally remember that story. So I think that, whatever we think of his politics, it's a marvelously successful allegory that like makes this stuff real to people, that helps you to understand these social issues, and how like in terms of like the way a science fiction story plays with how technology impacts our lives, and the kind of structure of society. but then to the earlier question of the political stance and, like, where does Heinlein stand in all this? I think that, and there's kind of a spoiler alert here, so plug your ears if you don't want it, the ending spoiled. But the ending.
If you're here, you're getting the spoil. Go ahead.
The way that our hero gets the better of the revolutionary villain in the ending, is that he kind of understands his psychology. And the revolutionary is this kind of like callow and selfish kind of a guy that is so like easily tricked. So in terms of this question of Heinlein's libertarianism and like, what does this say about like the kind of origins of tech bro sci-fi fandom in people like Elon Musk or whatever, the way they misunderstand Robinson's Mars trilogy, all that. It's really interesting to see the way these revolutionaries who are agitating for better working conditions are in fact really selfish and shitty kind of people.
Right. Well, yeah, and see, that's the thing is, whenever Heinlein over the years he's writing, Moon is the Heart's Mistress is very clearly libertarian, right? Stranger in a Strange Land is very much like kind of like a free love type thing. And then you have Starship Troopers, which is like crypto fascist, like,
I gotta argue about that because it's not fascist, it's a democracy. Once you get out of the service, you're allowed to vote. I always it is not a fascist society. Now whether you argue, I mean, I think the big argument of that book is whether
I so disagree with you. But go
fair
ahead.
enough. I mean, the thing is, I think it's just questioning what is the rule of the citizen and the society. I mean, I'm actually a patron of David Gerald, and David Gerald was very influenced by Heinlein stylistically. And I think he always feels that book is always misunderstood, and unfortunately Paul Verhoeven had a weird take on it because I think
he
he had a weird he satirized it, and and I think Gerald said a long time ago, had he had a chance to write the script, he would have presented what Heinlein did, present the ideas, and you can argue for or against them. But I do want to say another point.
I actually like Starship Troopers. I just don't agree with what I think is the point. But
I do want to point out an interesting thing about this story, and I'm wondering if I'm getting ahead of myself of why it's in here, because it seems like people. I remember it being at a panel at a con, and I think people seem to fixate on the roads themselves. They forget that it was about a labor struggle or a political struggle or somebody taking over. They think about the roads. It seems like that's what pops into people's mind. They forget about, I think, what the plot was. They just said, ooh, interesting gadget, or the gadget is overshadows the story.
Yeah, and we should be clear, the gadget is pretty much a MacGuffin in this story. It doesn't even make like a ton of sense. Like,
well, he tries to defend it. I think he might have, I mean, he goes on a very exposition, and I don't mind exposition scenes. I'm very pro exposition, and he goes on an exposition of the fall of what he believed would lead to the demise of the American car, which obviously didn't happen for various reasons, and he defends that, and he does go in world build of why we have these roads and why they're practical and they're part of the national interest.
Well, and this plugs into like what is such a current social problem, where it's sort of, even back then he saw that there's this problem with urban sprawl, there's this problem with cars and traffic and whatever. And the only reason that those problems were never solved is that we have such a strong auto industry lobby, right?
Right. Well, and you know that if the moving roads existed in this, they would have a lobby, they would have like powerful forces. But I got the impression that they weren't everywhere, that this was like kind of a California innovation, and I could be wrong about that. But it's one of the reasons why I think it takes place in California. But then also you have the interesting thing of the guy from Australia coming check out the roads just in time to see them all blow up and all that stuff. It's an interesting part of the story of it, not just like the points he was trying to make. And I could be wrong about that whole just California thing, but that's kind of the impression I got on that. But I could be wrong totally. So but yeah, so anything else really on the themes of the story? This one didn't like the characters were interesting, but a little like there wasn't like a too deep kind of thing going on with the characters. This is more of a gee whiz idea story. So I think with a little bit stronger characters, it might have been a stronger story, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think we have three characters of note. We got Larry Gaines, who's our main POV character throughout most of the story, who's the head engineer of the roads and trying to solve the problem. And again, trying to solve the problem non-violently and equitably and using his brains. I mean, Ted is right. He did, psych the guy out into then getting control of the situation. And then we obviously have Van Keek, who is our villain, who has taken over the Sacramento station, and he declares, what his thesis is of functionalism. And the other major character is Harvey, who seems to be representative of the good worker. I mean, he's the one who challenges Van Cleek during the union meeting in the first section of the book and saying that, hey, things are good. We could get maybe, they're better than they were 20 years ago when I went on strike. And, maybe we should work this out, try to work it out in a more less disruptive way. Although strikes are meant to be disruptive. But again, I don't know if as I said, since they didn't declare a strike, is it a strike?
Right. Well, it's more of a direct action, really, to be honest with you. It's more of sabotage than it is that. So, but yeah, Ted, anything on the characters or the
one thing that kind of interested me, and this is like not central, but this was in listening to the radio dramatization, is the way that it's bookended with Gaines's interaction with his wife, who's just sort of like, I thought we were gonna go on a nice date, and he's like, sorry honey, I gotta go deal with this emergency.
Yeah, and then of course the thing that makes it out of date science fiction is he leaves the number of the restaurant he's going to be at, which plays heavily into Nerves, the nuclear power plant meltdown of Lester Del Rey, where no one could get a hold of the engineer because he was out clubbing, in the story, and nobody foresaw pagers or cell phones, but or a walkie-talkie. I don't know, anything. Like if you're gonna be in charge of this stuff, maybe have a radio. But yeah, it was.
And he's like, oh no, I left my wife at the dinner place last night, and like she still hasn't heard from me.
Right. Well, and I think those of us who like to, I mean, that's one of the things is this about reading out of date science fiction, is you're getting kind of a view into what this guy living in LA in 1940 was thinking about this possible future, and like, you're extrapolating and getting a view into a very personal view of the future from the past. And his 50 years in the future is now decades in our past, which is just mind-blowing when you think about it. So
I don't know if I would agree that this story is about a possible future. I'm kind of a William Gibson guy. Science fiction is always about the year in which it is written. I think that especially since the engineering project is so implausible, that I mean, like, just like, how could it possibly be efficient to make these roads that roll? I think that he's telling a story using a science fictional conceit about labor issues that were very current, and especially about like I was saying, the problem of urban sprawl, the problem of cars, like it's just not sustainable. to bring a middle class lifestyle to like every American, you know.
Sure. Well, yeah, and I it's like that whole thing of where Don Wilhelm wanted Phil to put Martian time slip 100 years in the future, and he didn't give a shit, about he was like Don Wilhelm was like, "There's no way we'll be living on Mars by then," and then Phil was like, you know,
Whatever.
it's 1994, dude. I don't know what to tell you.
Although I always remember Paul Cornell, we were talking about at a convention, was talking about Jerry Anderson, and he felt one of the mistakes that Jerry Anderson did in his TV shows was set his shows in a future which he would most likely live in, so people can then tell you what you got right and what you got wrong.
Right. Well, and I think one of the joys of reading retro sci-fi is that you get this window into this surreal future that never was. So, uh, I hear you, William Gibson, through Ted, but I think there's a place in between where science fiction exists, and I like that place in between. Now, my thoughts on this being a science fiction Hall of Fame story. I think it is worthy. I think it's a better story. Well, it's probably my least favorite of the four I've read so far. If I was going to be ranking them, it's a better story than Helen of Loy. But Helen of Loy does a lot of interesting things, commenting on the 30s. And but if you're asking me, is this Heinlein's best story to be an entry in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame? I'm going to have to say that I might have gone with Universe, his generation ship story, although I don't know if that's novella length now that I think about it. But my first inclination is that Universe is a better short story, or what's the zombies one that
All You Zombies.
All You Zombies, Predestination, that became Predestination, was adapted very well into Predestination, by the way. I think All You Zombies probably is Heinlein's best short story, but I could see why that didn't have the impact that The Roads Must Roll had. So I can also understand why it was here. What say you, Juan? Do you think this is the best example of Heinlein short fiction, and do you think it deserves to be in the Hall of Fame?
I admire it, but at the same time, I felt there were better stories. If we're looking at his early career, I mean, I think Requiem is a better story because it has a very emotional center. It's the last Dee Harriman who. And this was written before The Man Who Sold the Moon. So we have Dee Harriman, a guy who created the enterprise of getting men on the moon and building lunar colonies. But yet, by the time he can get away from running the business, he's too old to get into a rocket ship, or they won't let him go to the moon for health reasons. And he finds a way, he schemes a way to get on a ship. And again, spoilers for a 80-year-old story. He makes it to the moon and dies there, but dies there in a way that he's bliss. I made it. I made it to the moon. I made it into space. And I think that I'm kind of surprised that, particularly to the six, this was voted on in the 60s, if I recall correctly. I think they would have liked a more emotional resonant story rather than a very well written device story or gadget story.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I would also say, I would then after that put, if this goes on, which I would, talk about revolution and unfortunately, dealing with a fascist government in the United States based on a religion.
Yeah. Maybe too close to home. Yeah.
Well, not in 1960.
Not 1960. You're right. Yeah.
Or 66 or whenever they voted on these.
Right. This was in the late 60s, but early 70s. Early 70s, I think. Ted, do you have a Heinlein story you prefer?
Well, I'm going to go against the grain here, and I'm going to say that I think that this is a great representative Heinlein story, especially in terms of like Heinlein's historical importance as this sort of godfather of hard science fiction, and the way that it is so accessible, it is so easy to read and kind of like get the picture, the way that it kind of like dramatizes a social problem in the car thing, the union thing. I think that it's really a great first taste to Heinlein. Although, I mean, I wouldn't argue that it's like a great first taste of his like literary sort of style in terms of like the characters are a little bit flat and one dimensional. But in terms of it being like a great like science fiction story of like thinking about society, I think that it's a really great way in. However, my favorite Heinlein story that I'll just give a quick pitch for is The Menace from Earth, which I had in one of those. It was like an ex-library copy of the short story collection of the same name. And one of the things that was so memorable to me about The Menace from Earth, although I couldn't summarize it, was that there is sort of like sports on the moon that like take advantage of the like low gravity on the moon, and the main character has this like wingsuit, and she goes into this like gym where you can fly using this like wingsuit, enjoying the like low gravity of the moon. And so in terms of like Heinlein's literary style and characterization, and especially the fact that it's like this empathetic treatment of a woman character, which is kind of against the grain of a lot of hard sci-fi, and especially like old school sci-fi that's all about great men. I think that The Menace from Earth is a pretty interesting one to look at, although I don't know if I would say it's the number one anthology piece.
Right. Well, no, I have read that one. I remember liking that one too. Well, yeah, and I'm not saying the story doesn't fit as far as that it's not worthy or valid. I just, with a lot of these, I think of other stories by these writers that I prefer. And Yeah, but with Heinlein, he had to be here. He had to be in the Hall of Fame. He is so important. There's a lot of writers who are missing from the Hall of Fame, and that has to do with the fact that their star or their the knowledge of them kind of grew after this time. It's a crime that Philip K. Dick's not in there, but it's understandable because he wasn't the success that his success came long after his death. If you ask me, Norman Spinrad and Barry Malzberg should be in there because they're favorites of mine. C.L. Moore is in there under a pen name, but I think she deserves to be there. And Judith Merrill's there, but Lee Brackett is not. Like, how is Lee Brackett not in this? It doesn't make any sense to me. But it's one of those things. So anything else on the Roads Must Roll? I don't go incredibly long in these Hall of Fame episodes about these stories because they are short stories, but I think it's important to discuss each of these and their role. And I do think that Roads Must Roll, what it plays in social science fiction, is almost more important than Heinlein. There's plenty of stories that could have come from Heinlein, and I think the role of tackling social issues is the most important thing. It's more so than the gadget in this story is the social issues, in my opinion. Juan, any closing thoughts on Roads Must Roll?
As I said, I mean, it's a good story. I just felt that, I guess the thing is, Requiem hit me in a way that affected me in a different way, and it hit a different key in it than this story would have. I mean, there's some interesting things, but as I said, it seems like as I said, people tend to remember the gadget more than the social implications of it. At least that's been my impression, and I could, prove me wrong.
Yeah, I tend to be the opposite. I tend to look at these social things, but I like both. Ted, roads must roll. Final thoughts.
So I think it's a great intro to Heinlein, but it's definitely not his peak. And I'll leave you with an image. While I was preparing for this podcast, my girlfriend and I just moved into a new house that she bought, brand new house, right? There's this high wind and the power goes out, and we're hearing this like banshee wail of the like heating system like groaning in the wind, which the people that built the house for us assure us is normal, and the roof is like flying off the house, and I can't use my CPAP machine. And I'm just like, man, it's really that like vision of society where from the roads must roll, where just like a little bit goes wrong and everything's breaking down.
Well, yeah, and I think Heinlein, used science fiction effectively to look at these little cracks in society. And even when like Moon is a Heart's Mistress is a book that I didn't particularly like, but I understand the value of it. And even if Heinlein doesn't like tickle my fancy quite as much as a Spinrad or a Le Guin or a PKD, I appreciate his role in the genre and the history of the genre. So, all right. So this is our February episode of our monthly science fiction Hall of Fame. In March, we have Microcosmic God by Ted Sturgeon. I'm working on a pretty powerful group of Sturgeon heads to talk about this story. But for those of you who are not familiar with Teddy Sturgeon, he's a really interesting cat. And I recommend checking out his novels while you can. But the story is going to be a good one. And or at least I suspect it will be a good one. I haven't read it yet. So I will be discovering. I've read a couple Ted Sturgeon novels before, but I have not read this story. I've read More Than Human and what was it? X minus Venus minus one, which is a really excellently weird new wave novel. And I'm very familiar with the guy, but I have not read this story yet. Did I say that name wrong, Juan? You're looking at me like
I'm trying to remember the story. I mean, the thing is, I'm a big fan of the Dreaming Jewels. I remember just somebody put out a new edition of that, and I hadn't read it, and it was just, I just have really good memory vibes of reading that story, even though I don't remember it in great detail, which makes it fun. I can read it again and hopefully get the same reaction to it.
I'm sitting here looking at my shelves and I don't know where the Teddy Sturgeon is, but I know I have that book somewhere.
No, I had a friend who was very passionate about Ted Sturgeon, and I actually gave her to collect. I forget, somebody was trying to put all the Ted Sturgeon stuff in books in the 80s and 90s, and I got her several copies of it.
And very famously wrote Amok Time, the episode of Star Trek. And I know from the when I went to do the DC Fontana research at the Roddenberry papers that he was very late turning in that script and made much of the staff of that show very angry. And what the hell is this Ted Sturgeon guy doing? He's late. There's lots of notes about that. And then however, a lot of that final draft of that script was written by DC Fontana, actually. So a lot of the things that you know or love and remember from that episode were Dorothy Fontana, actually. Because that script was super late, which is funny. All right, so Juan, tell the folks how they can find you if they want to discuss science fiction with you.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Rainbow War 71. That's the best way you can find me. I'm also on Facebook. I try to be interesting on my social medias. And I
You're
think,
under no obligation to be interesting, Juan, if you don't want to
oh,
be.
I think you do. At least you should try to be. Yeah, that's about it. I just do guest shots on other people's shows, like your lovely show.
Well, thank you, sir. And we definitely like having you. And yeah, and if people haven't checked out that V episode is great. It was a big panel, a lot of people. And V was my favorite, one of my favorite shows of all time. So that's why it was episode number 100. Ted, how can the folks find you?
So I'm on Twitter at T3DY. I don't consider it an obligation to be interesting. I think the obligation is to be cantankerous and argumentative. And you can reach me by email at ted.hand@gmail.com.
And you might find Ted and I, if you're a part of that Philip K. Dick class that David Gill's teaching, we're having fun hanging out over there, being dickheads. In fact, in a couple weeks, I take over for a night, and I'm teaching the Philip K. Dick formula, which is going to be super exciting.
And I'll be talking about Dick's interest in alchemy.
Yeah, so we're both presenting over there, so you can find us there. Well, too late, because if you didn't register, it's too late. But we're having a lot of fun doing that class.
Can you just sit in on a session, or is it on?
No, you got to pay for it, because Gil was making up for he lost some classes teaching this semester, so trying to make up some income. So thanks to California state budget cuts. But I will say I will be teaching the formula at the Philip K. Dick Fest in Colorado this summer, and I will be filming that so people will be able to catch it. I'm going to go more in depth in Colorado anyways because I'm going to have more time. So, but you can also read about all that in my upcoming book, Unfinished PKD, which will be coming next year. So working on the final edits for that. So for folks who made it this far, you're awesome. You're total nerds. And we'll see you next time for Teddy Sturgeon. And I'm sure these guys will be back at other episodes of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. I'm trying to switch it up all over the place and have all kinds of different awesome people. Thank you guys. You guys were great. And so, yeah, the roads must continue to roll. So keep it rolling, folks.